Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, making handle scales on your belt grinder. This video is one in a series of videos about knife handles covering various aspects of handle construction and design. In today's video, I'll be focusing on the grinding of handles on the belt grinder. Now, there's a lot of stuff you can do with a belt grinder that's pretty darn obvious. So what I'm going to try and show in this video is how to get that extra bit of performance out of your grinder, how to really make it sing, how to find extra layers of performance that are kind of hiding under the obvious. Alright, let's jump into it. I'll be using this dummy knife to show several different approaches to handle grinding, so I'll be slapping several different scales on it to show some different approaches. I'm using micarta scales here, scales being the term for the slabs of material that surround the steel tang of the blade. Most of the techniques I'll be showing here apply to pretty much any handle, but of course different materials grind differently, so some techniques are a little trickier to use with wood than with synthetic materials like G10 or micarta. I generally trim my scales from rectangular blanks on the bandsaw, being fairly generous and staying outside the lines I've marked. You can always take off more material, but you can't put it back. Assuming you're attaching your handle scales with pins, whether you're using Corby fasteners, pins, loveless screws, or something similar, your first job will be to grind off the pins. I do this on the face of my flat platen. A couple of things to be wary of. First, don't blast away too hard. You can get the pins so hot that you'll burn your handle scales. Moreover, you can also burn out any epoxy or cyanoacrylate or other glues that you've used to hold the pins in, compromising their strength. So go slow, rotating from pin to pin until you're all done. These are fairly short tube rivets which don't heat up as badly as solid pins do, so I'm able to clear the excess pretty quickly. Notice that when it gets to the point where I need them flush with the scale, I'm grinding up and down the platen rather than side to side. You'll see me using this technique quite a bit today. The reason I'm doing it here is that when grinding pins flush, it's easy to get the blade just slightly out of parallel with the face of the platen, at which point this happens. Now there are a number of reasons to be very cautious about this technique, all of which I'll get into later. Doesn't mean you can't do it, you just need to be cautious. The next task is to remove excess material around the periphery of the tang. Again, I'll be using the flat platen. I'll show the grinding of a handle using a contact wheel later. If you like that technique, you could just as easily do a lot of this work on a wheel rather than a platen. I recommend using a relatively fresh belt for handle grinding. Once a belt becomes fairly worn, it generates lots of heat, which can burn your handle material. Here I'm using a Combat Abrasives 40 grit ceramic belt. This will really hog off a lot of material, allowing you to work efficiently without burning the handle material. There's no great trick to what I'm doing here. I'm just working my way down through the handle material until I see sparks. As soon as I hit metal, I ease up substantially and start blending things. I've been doing this long enough that I can visually keep the blade pretty square and symmetrical, but if you want to guarantee symmetry and squareness, you can grind the perimeter of your knife on your table or a tool rest. Now the top of the knife is pretty easy to get right, but I've intentionally chosen a handle shape with a bunch of interior curves. How can we handle those? Well, I'll show you a smorgasbord of possibilities, some of which may work on the grinder that you own, some of which may not. Bear in mind here, of course, I'm using my Bader B3, which has removable arms and wheels. Your machine may or may not work the way mine does. The overall lesson here is, even if your grinder won't do what the Bader will, you want to mine your grinder for every possible capability, even ones that the manufacturer never anticipated. Your grinder may be able to do some really interesting things that you wouldn't think of at first blush. Anyway, back to the knife. So one thing you can do when you're roughing is just to use the corner of the platen. You tend to get a very rough, harsh finish. Fine for rough grinding, but not so good for finish work. Even when roughing, you still want to be cautious about going too gung-ho and gouging the work. In any case, this is something you can do on the table or off. No matter what you do, these corners will eventually be impossible to finish any better, so let's look at some other ways of doing the same job. First, anytime you can use existing curves on your grinder, go for it. Many grinders have contact wheels available in a wide variety of diameters. If yours does that, great, but what about the ones you've already got on your machine right now? This is not a contact wheel, it's just an idler, but you can use it to grind interior curves, like so. Because it doesn't have a soft rubber surface, it'll never give you quite the surface finish of a wheel intended for grinding. But what we're doing here is just establishing geometry. Surface finish comes later. The advantage of corralling one of these wheels is that you don't have to waste a bunch of time switching to a new wheel or attachment. That said, maybe you're not happy with the radii that are available on your favorite grinding attachment. Okay, if you've got multiple attachments, there are all kinds of wheels available. You can harness large wheels, tiny wheels, or wheels with different radii that just happen to be on other attachments, as is in the case with the wheels on this slack belt fixture for my baiter. Again, the point is, just because you don't immediately find the exact radius that you want on your normal setup doesn't mean you can't find a way to get there somewhere on your grinder. In my case, I've got an attachment that will let me grind some nice small radii in places like the guard area on this knife. Let me jump in here to mention that today's video is sponsored by Combat Abrasives. They're a family-owned American manufacturer offering a wide selection of belts. Now, I've used many of their belts, including ceramic, aluminum oxide, and zirconium. The prices are good, and their focus is specifically on the knife-making community. Their basic aluminum oxide belts come in at a good price point and last a lot longer than some of the inexpensive belts that I've used in the past. Another thing that I've really been excited about is their ceramic belts for roughing in the 40, 60, and 120 grit range. Their performance is very competitive with the big manufacturers at about half the price. So check out their online shop by clicking the link in the description. Now it's time to profile the faces of the handle scales. You can taper scales side to side, end to end. You can have them thinner toward the blade and thicker toward the pommel. There's no right way to do it. I'll be doing another video in a few weeks where I talk about handle design and what the rationales are for various handle shapes. But I won't worry about that here. This is just how, not why. First, let's thin this out some. Normally, I use correctly sized handle scales, but let's say I'm using stock that's a little too thick. I like to use the corner of the platen to really bite in and take the stock down quickly. Now, if you do this, be aware that you can easily overshoot, especially with a really aggressive belt like this one. So easy does it. Once I'm down to the thickness I want, I'll run it back and forth across the flat platen a little bit. Then I'll invert it and run it parallel to the belt. This will allow me to flatten the handle from one end to the other with no dips or wobbles. Sometimes I see handles made by guys who are just getting started, and they look like they'd be relatively comfortable in your hand, but they often seem kind of lumpy and irregular. By flattening the handle from stem to stern this way, you'll have a nice, smooth, regular shape from end to end, giving it a pleasing look to the eye. Once I've got it flat, I'll rotate it through an arc of about 30 degrees, doming the top of the handle. If I try to do this by working side to side in sections, it's easy to have an inconsistent radius, which looks a little bush league. By doing the entire length of the handle this way, you can give it a nice consistent radius from one end of the handle to the other. Watch your knuckles though. Speaking of which, some notes about working a blade down the flat like this. First, reality is you do need to be cautious, and not just because it might skin your knuckles. First, I prefer to hold the knife tip up. This way, if it grabs and hits the floor, it won't hit tip first and wreck the blade. Second, I never ever use this technique with any sort of tool rest or grinding table. If the grinder grabbed the knife and threw it into the table, it could rebound into my face or body. Third, I'm very careful about where the point of my knife is. If you get too gung-ho, you can knock the point of the knife into the belt and mess up your blade. It's not a safety issue, but it looks bad. Fourth, I don't do this with any grabby belts like Scotch-Brite or surface conditioning belts. They can really hurl a knife. Final point, your fingers get really close to the belt this way. Not the end of the world if you grind a knuckle, but just be aware that if that happens, you may drop the knife and it'll get flung to the floor. Awareness is the most important aspect of safety. It's like defensive driving. If you know something may be coming, you can prepare for it and react quickly and efficiently to avoid danger. Okay, so now we've got it domed, but if we stopped right here, we'd still have a really uncomfortable handle because the corners are very sharp. So the next step is to round these corners off and blend it all together. One way I'll do this is to work around the edges like so. Typically I start with a 45-degree grind, then work it outward in increasingly shallow angles in both directions. Notice that I don't stab or poke at it. I try to move as smoothly around it as I can. This is actually a really important aspect of grinding handles. Smooth circular motions will help blend everything and keep you from getting wobbles and dips. On a relatively complex handle like this, I may need to do the top and the bottom separately. In particular, the interiors of the curves have to be worked kind of carefully. I like using this little sliver of slack belt right here. Your grinder may be totally different from this, but these parts of the handle will generally blend more smoothly when ground on an unsupported belt. So of course, you could simply use a slack belt fixture if your grinder supports that. Lots of possibilities for soft blending here. Watch how I don't just rotate through an angle, I also move the handle side to side. If you don't do this, it's very easy to cut divots out of the handle with the corners of the belt. The more angles and directions and movements that you can use, the more your lines will blend. If you tend to repeat one motion over and over, you're more likely to get uneven grinding. Another way to get at those interior curves is to use the various wheels on your machine, like so. Easy does it. A small radius wheel can eat a giant hole in the handle in a heartbeat. Here I'm demonstrating this on a knife of a slightly different design. Now the knife I was just using has a natural finger relief in it, but maybe you want to put a finger relief into another type of blade. You can do it just like this. The trick is to orient the scale on an angle this way and this way. The result will be a profile that widens toward the exposed part of the tang. This particular knife is not really designed for that technique, so it looks a little dopey, but you get the point. So let's talk about finishing. So far all I've really done is kind of roughing everything out. Now most of the finish work is pretty much the same as roughing, only done with finer grit belts. But there are a few points worth mentioning. First, if you used an idler wheel to rough in an interior curve, the grind will always look a little harsh because of the hardness of the wheel. It exaggerates the grit and you can get belt bounce, which creates chatter marks. So you'll need to do something else when you finish. Here's where your belts make a big difference. Belts come in a variety of hardnesses. I'm not talking about the abrasive grit, I'm talking about the actual belt backing, the fabric that holds it together. When I move to these final grits, let's just say 320 in this case, I don't want to use a hard belt like this X-weight that I've been using. Great for bevels, not so great for handles. Instead, I'm using this Combat Abrasives J-weight belt. The backing is very flexible, allowing it to move smoothly inside the curves instead of digging in on the corners. For this reason, I like to keep both soft, flexible belts like these J-weight belts and hard belts like X-weights in the higher grits. If you're interested in some of the other terminology, I've got a link to another video that I did about all the terminology of belt types. Now I'll use my little sliver of slack here and blend everything together using the 320. Again, the actual slack belt fixture works great here too, but you don't always want to go to the trouble of changing attachments. A nice fresh belt is really important as you move up to these higher grits. If I try to get too much out of an old belt, especially a high grit belt, I'm just going to burn the micarta. Getting inside these curves can be tricky, but if you take your time, feathering it in nice and easily, you can get there. And notice how I work the butt of the knife. It's easy to get this section crooked, so I like to hold the knife like so, eyeballing it to make sure that it's nice and square to the machine, then sweep the blade in an arc so we get a nice smooth finish on the butt. As with all abrasive work, the goal here is to get rid of every single scratch from the heavier grit abrasives. Once I've achieved that goal, I want my handle to pass both the eyeball test and the tactile test. In other words, I want it to look good and feel good. All the various sections blended and smooth. A nice finishing approach here is to use a surface conditioning belt. Scotch-Brite's the 3M brand name we're all familiar with, but plenty of other manufacturers make them. Again, these are from our faithful sponsor, Combat Abrasives. Now be careful with surface conditioning belts. They're very grabby and will fling a knife if you're not careful, so hold them firmly in both hands. I most definitely do not use them vertically on the platen. If you catch the tip of your knife in that mesh, it'll go sailing for sure. Now, if I'm doing a utilitarian knife, that's pretty well where I'm stopping. On the other hand, if this is a collector grade knife, I'll continue with sandpaper and possibly other handheld abrasives, possibly buffing, possibly all kinds of things. But that's for another video. So here's the final result, goofy finger relief included. As you can see here, we're just doing this for demonstration purposes and we're not doing it for looks. Now the approach that we just used results in a handle that's more or less even in thickness from end to end. But if we want a palm swell or a butt swell, hey, don't even go there. Let's call it a pommel instead of a butt swell. Anyway, if you want that palm swell, you'll need to take a whole different approach. So for our second handle, that's what we're doing. In this case, we'll use a contact wheel. This is a 10-incher, which works pretty well for this type of handle. Anyway, the idea of the palm swell is that I want to have the handle higher here and lower here and here. The pommel section helps with retention, and the palm swell is both for comfort and for retention. I start by grinding in 2 lines or depressions which define the palm swell. I'm not just grinding straight down, I'm rocking the knife side to side. Also, notice how most of the time I'm rotating the knife on its axis, working both sides in quick succession so that the grinding will be symmetrical on both sides of the knife. If I just do one side and finish it and then flip it over and do the other side, it will be quite easy for one side to be a little bit offset from the other, and this will look bad. Eventually, just as in the other knife, I'll knock the corners down a little. Once you've got everything pretty well defined, you can keep refining the lines with the wheel or switch over to a slack belt setup. As in the previous knife, using a slack belt setup allows us to smooth transitions and remove facets that tend to form using any sort of hard support surface, whether it's a platen or a wheel. Again, I'm moving to a softer, more flexible belt. This is a 120 grit J weight belt from Combat Abrasives. The principles are the same as in the earlier case, just keep moving, don't linger, and work on those diagonals and long circular sweeping motions. When I'm on the insides, I'll pull it off the side of the belt. Experiment in doing this with the idea in mind of maximizing the smoothness and flow of the work. Like I said earlier, smoothness of movement will translate to smooth surfaces on the handle. Now you can finish up with high grit belts, say 320 or 400 grit belts, micron belts, whatever, or maybe surface conditioning belts. Of course, there are also buffers and hand sanding. It all depends on what you're aiming for. Again, here we're just aiming to show how you do the basic shaping. What you end up with using this technique is a really comfortable, smooth handle. It's great for outdoor knives, choppers, hunters, and things of that nature. Alright, so there we have it. Two very different approaches to blade grinding, one based on the platen, the other on the wheel. Obviously, these demos haven't been taken to a high level of fit and finish. This is just a demonstration, but as you can see, there are a lot of nuances to making nice handles. And the good news is that there are lots of different kinds of handle types and lots of ways to make them. Bottom line here, every grinder is different, but you'll find that even very simple grinders that don't have gobs of attachments and arms and so on still have a lot of capability if you're resourceful. If you're enjoying these videos about making knife handles, in a couple of weeks I'll have another one in the series. The next one, handle design. Now it might seem like a handle's just a handle, but there are a lot of things to consider when designing a handle, so in the next video we'll talk them all through. Alright, thanks and see you soon. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make hamones or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make hamones, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.